We live in geopolitics as a TV reality show. Like that's where somebody's actually thinking of, what kind of ratings will this announcement get? What kind of ratings will this attack get?
Yeah.
Pretty wild world.
You're growing like 200-300% in the early years.
Yeah.
I never wanted to be an entrepreneur.
So I'm definitely an emerging market junkie. I like to go to the frontier.
Okay. Give us the meat, Abdallah.
You need to be able to make the sacrifices that are required for this journey.
Take pride in your job. This too shall pass.
Yes.
I think it's important to note for the listeners that we are taping on Friday what are we today, 22?
24th? No?
22nd, no, 22nd of April.
It's day 56.
When this comes out, maybe the landscape might have shifted, but I think what we're going to focus on today is maybe not so attached with the headlines. We're gonna talk about a slightly longer time frame, right? Like how will all of this impact the UAE specifically and the region, right? And what can we do about it?
We can talk about anything you want. We can go 30,000 feet in the air. We can go down into the weeds, whatever. You just direct me.
Awesome. Let's talk about the news, I guess. So we are now, there was a ceasefire, but now obviously there is like a new deadline, like 3 to 5 days from my understanding. There's strike plans being made as we speak. I'm not sure how that's going to happen. What's your read about what's going on now vis-a-vis Dubai, the UAE?
I'd say for the UAE, where we are at the moment, as I say, in kind of day 56 of this, would be that we're in the middle of a coercive pause of the conflict, right? We haven't got a conclusive resolution. And the United States and Iran are in the middle of a kind of cold phase of a hot war. That would be the best way to sum it up. Obviously, as you say, by the time this come out, the landscape could shift quite a lot. But I think when you look at it for the perspective of the UAE, the debate internationally has been very interesting, right? So there's kind of two camps. And when I think of what's going on, I think of the UAE as a system. And I think we should frame this conversation through systems thinking. And rather than thinking of it as a country, which of course it is, but view it through the theoretical lens of systems thinking. And what we've seen so far in this debate, right, is you have two camps. You have one camp here, which is this is kind of the end of the UAE, right? We've seen this sensationalism at the start of this. And in that debate, you have a spectrum. You have an extreme spectrum, which is basically the Daily Mail, right? Which is, this is the end of the UAE and blah, blah, blah. It's completely vacuous. It's a waste of time even discussing it because obviously it's a geographical fact. The country is going to remain. But if you zoom up the spectrum on that side to more kind of introspectful, thoughtful people, you still see a narrative externally. Like, let's try personify it. Say Rory Stewart, who is a former Conservative MP in the UK. He has a big podcast with Tony Blair's former comms man, Alistair Campbell. And I saw on BBC, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, he's saying this will set a place like Dubai back, I think he said up to 15 years, right? Okay. Now, it's easy once someone like Rory Stewart opens his mouth, it's easy to kind of dismiss him as a kind of Etonian snob, I suppose, right? Okay. Everything is like, Dubai is set back 15 years. Okay. So a lot of people dismiss him. But actually, I quite like his analysis, and he's quite thoughtful about things. And that's why it's interesting hearing him say this. I believe he was some kind of diplomat in the Middle East, in Iraq or something. But, like us Westerners feel like we spent 6 months in the Middle East and we're experts in the Middle East. I'm here 20 years and I'm still very conscious of that fact, okay, that you're trying to look at things objectively. He spent some time in the Middle East. He was an MP, but he feels very comfortable making these wild statements that it set the UAE back or Dubai back 15 years.
Based on what though? Does he offer any, any reasons?
Well, this is a great question because he's viewing things through the prism. And this is why it's easy for a lot of people, once they hear him say this, to dismiss him because he's a product of his own environment, right? And I'm not so sure, and if he looks at your podcast now, he's going to be quite annoyed, but I'm not so sure that he's looking at it in a kind of holistic way. What he's seen is, like everybody, is this kind of algorithmic keyhole, right? Everybody's looking at things through social media. And at the beginning of the shock to the system, right, February 28th, obviously everyone from a social media point of view around the world. And what he's viewing it on is the British that left at the beginning of the process, a lot of the kind of influencers and whatnot. And I think one of the points he made was, if you live in a tower that's 50 floors high, that was his analysis. If you live in a high tower and Dubai is full of high towers and there's these attacks taking place, well, then who's going to be there, right? And I just feel like this lack of any kind of structured understanding of what actually is going on here, it's bizarre. When you look at the other side of the discussion, right? So let's just think about the aggregate demand and everybody that remained in the UAE during this situation, which was the vast majority of people. Okay, yeah, sure, some people left, but the vast majority of people stayed. You see that when you go and drive down Sheikh Zayed Road, or if you go to a shopping mall, right? So therefore, then the other camp, the narrative for a lot of people who remained, is around this idea of the UAE has come through, you had the debt crisis, the financial crisis, you had mid-2014, the oil prices fell, and that impacted the UAE. You had that was a tricky time from an economic point of view, minor. Then you fast forward and you have COVID, right? Which, if you're a conspiratorial person, you would think this is a pandemic that's designed to damage an economic model like the UAE, right? Trade, transport, tourism, financial services, etc., right? And yet the UAE came out of all of these situations stronger. And that seems to be the narrative from everybody here. And I buy into that narrative, right? But what we're not doing, and what the folks here need to do, is articulate why that is. Why does the UAE always come out of these shock periods in a better, stronger position? And the answer to that is, if you look at the UAE as a system and you think of it in holistic terms, right, through systems thinking, and what you have when you apply a systems lens to things is you have this kind of dense, interconnected, multiple organs that are layered together, right? So think of your body as a system, right? You have all these organs that are working together, and it either creates a healthy system or a failing system. In the UAE, you'd have, obviously, defense. From a military point of view, you'd have political leadership, economy, supply chains, everything that's happening within the system. And within those systems, you have feedback loops. And these feedback loops, they either strengthen or bolster trust and confidence in the system, which results in it coming out stronger, or it weakens them. And what the UAE has been incredibly good at doing is the system that it has created is a system that, when pressure is applied to that system, it comes out stronger. And it's been able to do that primarily in these shock periods like COVID, is that the system has positive feedback loops, and then the government is very agile and it pulls a lever, a reform leader. And that reform piece for this will be critical. But the system, the agility of the system is critical.
Okay.
So you have a shock period, you have pressure that's applied, and in a strong system, a healthy system, it comes out stronger. In a weak system, you have a deterioration.
Yeah.
The UAE has this knack for coming out in a stronger position. And that's because it is able to do a few things. First of all, it's able to absorb the shock, okay? Which again, in this example that we're living through now.
The interceptions and everything
interceptions and keeping all the people here.
Yeah.
It's not this algorithmic social media feed that everybody is seeing, right? The vast majority of people are here in the UAE.
Yeah.
The second thing that you're able to do is you take lessons from that, right? You learn the lessons and then you institutionalize the lessons faster than anyone else through reform.
Yeah.
And then when you look at these things, what you see is if you zoom out, because we're all obsessed now with like day 56.
Mm-hmm.
But when you zoom out of this, inevitably in 5-10 years' time, when we're looking back at this, what you'll see as a result of systems thinking and as a result of the healthy body, the system that this is, what you'll see is that these shocks, although undesirable, unwanted, uncomfortable at the time, actually become accelerators of necessary adaptation.
Yeah.
Like it's the lessons that we have to learn. And something hopefully this is proven right, but in the future, there will be some kind of black swan event where the necessary adaptations that we learn through this lesson will be advantageous to the system. Yeah. Exactly the way COVID was to this shock.
You said a lot. I want to unpack a few things with you. So with regards to the comment, obviously, on the vast majority staying here, I think clearly a lot of the tourism has been impacted, right?
The floating population, definitely.
And I think that's normal. And I think, denying that doesn't make sense. If you are considering visiting, I think you will definitely ask the question before you make that decision. And I think maybe that's why we saw, at least initially, a drop in footfall in malls, for example. Maybe you wouldn't see the traffic, as you said, on the streets, but then things are really picking up. I can tell you anecdotally, like we're back to school today. I dropped off my kids this morning. Again, things look normal. The roads are busy. I went to a restaurant last night. It was on the Palm. Actually, it was quite busy. So you're seeing, I think, as you said, there was a shock.
Yeah.
And then there was a reaction to the shock because there was a lot of uncertainty. We still have a lot of uncertainty. I don't think we're over that yet. But I think what you're saying and what I agree on is I think that the system has proven resilient. But of course, I think it's very normal that something like tourism would be hit. And
the floating population, as in any sectors who are exposed to inbound high-end tourism, they're going to hurt.
Yeah.
Right? There's it's a shock period.
Yeah.
There's no getting around that.
Yeah. By the way.
But that is a different narrative than people saying, for example, this is the end of the UAE.
Yeah.
No, that's tourists are not coming.
Yes. Yeah.
And tourism slows down in the summer. You could think of this in a way as, depending on where the geopolitics land, this is going to be a really long, slow summer this year.
I think the facts, obviously, that ultimately, we all went through this in order to make our decisions whether to stay or leave. Ultimately, we felt pretty safe here, and most of us stayed. You and I met in a barbecue, whatever.
Yeah.
2 weeks ago, everyone was here, right? So I think, there's the counter narrative to that is those influencers that went on social media to say like, hey, everything's perfect, and
there was a lot of that, and there was two extremes.
There are two extremes, honestly.
Extremes,
yeah,
right?
I mean, it's not like normal, and it's not cataclysmic. Like
Exactly.
we're somewhere in the middle, and we're okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's the more nuanced narrative that should come out, is that we're here, we're safe. We didn't pack our bags and leave. One point though, I think some sectors will probably suffer more than others, right? I mean, you have a wide sort of the makeup of the UAE. You have a big South Asian population, for example, that are here and so on. So it's the makeup of the UAE is very interesting. You have, I think, 200 nationalities, and maybe the impact of this war was a little bit different on others. Do you see any differences? Because some of these sectors, let's say, might suffer more than others, or not really?
Definitely. It's there'll be sectors that will be counter-cyclical that will benefit, right? Half of our business is like peak demand at the moment because of this, right? But then you have like discretionary advisory work that people will say, well, let's push that to kind of Q4. The key thing obviously is where the geopolitics and all of this lands. But in the meantime, there's two ways I would look at it. One is the immediate impact from a demand point of view. And what you'd want to do is kind of build a table of resiliency, okay? And let's work our way from the top. If I was, say, an investor, an entrepreneur, CEO, and I'm looking at how can I tap into who's going to hold up in terms of demand best, I would say, and all of these are nuanced, right? You want to, even within it, there'd be subcategories of where demand holds up better, where it's more stable, and there'd be other elements where it's going to be weaker. In any kind of shock, you want to stay close to the government, right? Because closest to where the spending needs to happen. So I would say the most resilient sector will be coming from government and government spending, because there'll have to be a continuation of public administration, of, safety, regulation, utilities, all of that stuff holds up really well. So you're looking at government, healthcare, pharma. I'd say professional services holds up pretty well because these guys can pivot, right? If you're lawyers, there's going to be quite a bit of work in terms of disputes, in terms of HR and human capital employment issues, risk advisory, market intelligence, all of that stuff is going to stay pretty strong. And then you start getting into the less kind of resilient. You're going to have the sectors that were exposed or are, I would say, moderately resilient. And you've got the likes of, say, manufacturing, construction, which are still carrying on, but the increase in costs for their supply chains are obviously increasing. You have the likes of energy, agriculture, chemicals, mining, this stuff, again, continuing, but some of them were impacted as a result of the war. Now, some of them are going to make a lot of money as a result of that because there's such peak demand, but there's others that will be impacted. So they would be, I'd say, moderately resilient, depending on where you sit on that kind of spectrum of impact. And then you get into the sectors that are more exposed. I'd say education holds up reasonably well, right? From an overall kind of demand point of view, it will hold up, I would say, reasonably well. But you would also have, again, those students who were coming in from different parts of the world. All of that slows down. And then the ones that are exposed, right? I would say, depending on how long this goes on, I think real estate has held up pretty well. Obviously, it's been impacted, but it's held up pretty well compared to what people would have imagined in terms of the circumstances.
Yeah.
If someone had described what has happened over the last 56 days a year ago, they would have described, a place like Dubai almost an exodus. And that didn't happen. Like that's an incredible thing. I'm on the board of a real estate developer. I see, and obviously things are slowing down. Obviously they're being impacted, but they're still making sales.
Yeah.
Which is incredible. And then you'd have kind of those highly exposed. So you have anything in kind of PR, media, advertising, right? Everyone stops advertising in times like this, right? They just take a beat. And then the most exposed, obviously, travel and tourism. And anyone, as you mentioned earlier, Lou, who is exposed to the floating population. So the tourists that come in and they go to, the high-end restaurants and
even luxury. I think luxury sales,
luxury retail. Yeah, exactly. So again, retail is probably moderately resilient. You've got one side of it where you've got your daily demand, your supermarkets, all that kind of stuff. But then on the other side of it, you'll have your high-end luxury where inbound tourism, that's going to be impacted. Yeah.
And I think that's a great picture that you've just laid out here, because I think it's important to acknowledge like some of the narratives out there, but as you said, it's important to understand why you think this is going to be resilient and provide the data points. So
Yeah.
some sectors will be impacted, some sectors
And
not.
this is all this is all where we are now. This
Yeah.
is what is going on, and we've hundreds of CEOs in our network, and they're all pretty much dependent on where they are in that spectrum. They're all saying, look, this is holding up much better than we would have anticipated.
Yeah.
But there's guys that are more exposed. This is what is happening now, and this is a relatively, there's going to be chapters of this, and we're still in this kind of early shock phase where people are now beginning, you're moving from shock to tension to processing and then into recovery.
Yeah.
And once we get into that recovery, if we think about the systems thinking, what the UAE is excellent at is really being quick and pulling that lever, what results in the next boom. Like, look, COVID is a perfect example, right?
So what happened what were some of the reforms that happened as a result of COVID?
COVID was everything. What the UAE is great at is don't waste a crisis. So it went from kind of social reforms, cohabitation and all this stuff, right up to golden visas. And then it kind of morphed in. You had companies law, you had massive reforms in terms of from the economic sector more broadly. And that just, it shifted, it shifted gears for the country completely. And this time, I think what will happen after this, inevitably, and this is true of the GCC, when we move into the next chapter, and that will happen, the next thing I think that whether you're a CEO, a policymaker, an investor, an entrepreneur, an NGO, whatever, anyone who's trying to evaluate and analyze the system will need to understand that most likely everything will be viewed through the lens of sovereign resiliency in the GCC. So
Can you explain sovereign resiliency?
like from an infrastructure point of view, right? It starts
So
off, it starts off from a defense point of view, right? How do we ensure that we can we're in a safe, structured environment where we can determine and control the inputs and outputs of the system, right? As much as is humanly possible. So that means, obviously from a defense point of view, it means from things like your infrastructure, your food security. Your food security will likely turn into food sovereignty. How do we turn the desert green? How do we grow even more stuff here? Your logistics and supply chains, which again, the country's done an amazing job. It will be strategic reserves, everything. It will be where you build data centers, all of this. So everything that was viewed through a lens of efficiency will now be viewed through a lens of resiliency. And if you're a startup or if you're an entrepreneur, that's the way I would view things. It's like, how do I help these countries in the GCC? How can I go and help them be more resilient? And there'll be that in itself, from an infrastructure point of view, that will be a big lever of growth. But again, you need to get the geopolitics to land in a way where everybody can find a balance where they can go about their.
It's funny, by the way, how founders always find opportunities. So someone I know, he's a great entrepreneur. He's built this trucking business called Trucker.
Okay, very good.
So basically, since the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, like his business has been booming. Like he's been transporting everything.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lesson there, and I guess probably this is what will be tackled next, right? This kind of single point of failure will probably not be
with everything
allowed anymore.
With everything, your logistics, your ports, your airports, does it make sense having a big, huge, have a big mega airport, but maybe you need some other airports. The interconnectivity between the region, you see train infrastructure going from the UAE to Jordan now. Your pipelines for energy and oil and gas and how you move that around the region. It will be a new paradigm. And humans are adaptation machines. The system will just adapt. And like I said, why the UAE is a healthy system is because it recognizes that these are actually accelerators of adaptations that will have to happen. And if COVID hadn't have happened, the UAE, the system, would have been far less prepared than what actually is happening for the shock that they're in now.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting. And I think what they're very good is that adaptation piece. And if you look, and this is zooming out, if you look at the direction of where the world is going, you know, we're in this very messy, predatory multipolarity, like this period of countries not operating in any semblance of international law. And it's very much, you know, the law of the jungle and prison rules. And if you have might, you're right, and you just do what you want to do. And political geography starts. We thought political geography wasn't that important anymore. And now we recognize that it is, right? If you're in the sphere of the United States, you have like the Gulf of Mexico went to the Gulf of America, right? Canada was chided as the next state of the United States. You Greenland. You know, political geography, we assumed had been kind of put to bed, and it's not.
Yeah.
All of the institutions just kind of crumble around us that we built over the last 100 years. And now we're building something new. And there'll be unbridled opportunity in that, and there'll be unbridled suffering in that for some people. But in there, what is most likely the adaptation that countries will need is resiliency. And the adaptations that will come out of this, I think, will actually serve the region well. Now, again, with the caveat that how does this all land between the United States and Iran in the end of it?
I want to ask you one clarifying question on what you said, and then I want to shift the conversation a little bit. But you talked about a systems thinking, like the UAE basically as a body, or even I think of it as an organization, to be honest. And you talked about feedback loops. Can you maybe give an example of like how does a feedback loop happen? And like I'm sure you've seen it in action. And
Now a great sociological example of this is when the crisis happened. Right. And obviously at the beginning, it was very surreal and there was this kind of shock period, and people, similar to COVID, again, human behavior, watching human behavior, everybody started to act a little bit weird. Right. The interceptors are clearly working, right, which is an incredible achievement, but we're still all cautious about our movements. A feedback loop that everybody could see, and this speaks to the political lever, is the president going to the mall, right? That went all over social media. After that, everybody just start moving, right? There's a feedback loop in that. Now, that's a small example of it, but the examples are multifold and constant. You know, there's signals in every sector, there's signals in every business, and these get fed back into the overall system.
I think the way I see it, at least on the startup side, because obviously I work with a lot of entrepreneurs and I invest in them, and I see the feedback loop in the sense that people from the government are always open, like they're always gathering entrepreneurs and people, listening to what's happening, getting feedback from the room, you know, trying to understand what are the challenges and the opportunities for them to work, you know, find solutions and not be the bottleneck.
This is a great example. So February 28th, right, was when the attack started. And then you had, I think it was I might be misremembering, but the Friday after that. So I got in touch with the UAE Minister of Economy, who's a friend, Abdullah bin Talk. And I said, you know, it would be great to connect with some of our members. You know, everybody's trying to figure out what is going on. So I think I spoke to him on the Tuesday. And the Friday night, so this is the Friday after, I had said to him, well, I'll get together a few of the clients. It ended up 150, right?
CEOs.
Yeah, on the Friday night. And that speaks to the kind of the spirit.
This was an in-person thing.
Yeah,
wow.
Exactly. That was on I'm almost sure it was the Friday after the Saturday. And that is the feedback loop. And what was really interesting, again, putting that kind of sociological kind of lens on things, that was the Friday, and it ended up there was 150 of us there. And the first two executives to speak, right? So me and the minister had a kind of fireside chat, and we were all kind of making sense of things together. The first two executives to speak were European executives. And both of them had flown, they were outside the country when the missile started, and they had flown back to the country through Oman. They flew into Oman and drove back over the border. And again, there's like in a kind of the ethnography of our, like what you were saying, it's a cosmopolitan place. The ethnography of our group of network is also very cosmopolitan. And you could analyze each of these groups differently because they're going to react based on their circumstances. Yeah. But I think the most interesting part of it is the first two are European executives, European CEOs, who made the point once the country came under attack, it wasn't to stay outside, it was to fly back and come into the country, right? Then I think it was a couple of weeks ago, we hosted one of our member meetings again, and we had Halal Al-Mari, right? Who's, for your viewers that aren't from the UAE, who is like the emirate level minister for economy at the Dubai side of things. Again, the feedback loop, it kind of speaks to, it speaks to the leadership style and the bolstering that trust and confidence. And what was really interesting for me, by this stage, there had been about 2,612 missiles, drones, aerial threats, right? I think in the end it got up to...
I think close to just over 2,800.
Yeah, exactly, right? So this was a couple of weeks ago. So by this stage, at that members meeting, we'd about 160 of our members. And what I realized when I went into that room was the most interesting insight was the fact that, okay, we've had 2,600 missiles and drones fired at 150, whatever was in the room. So about 16, 17 missiles or drones for each individual person had been fired at them in the room. And they're all sitting in the room. And what I realized there, Lou, was that I had been making a mistake in terms of my analysis of the UAE, because I have this weird job, right? So for the last kind of 20 years, broadly speaking, clients roll me out and I give a talk for global CEOs, for regional leadership teams, for government officials. And broadly speaking, I'm obviously boiling this down, the story I had been telling for the last 20 years, UAE, GCC more broadly, was really a story of economic diversification. Right? That's what everything kind of came down to, if you had to boil it down to a couple of words. And what I realized during this period was it was never just a story of economic diversification. It was a story of sociological diversification. So there has been a deliberate, very sophisticated statecraft, a very deliberate policy to broaden out the base of people, the profile of people, type of people who are emotionally, socially, financially, and structurally invested in the success of the UAE. That's what's been going on for the last 20, 25 years. Yeah. We're looking at it through, you're looking at it from investing in startups. I'm looking at it maybe from, a business outlook or the economy. But that's what's actually been happening. Think of it like a very complex beehive. And that's what has been created. And that sociological diversification manifests itself in a very interesting way, because what it leads to is a social connection, a social commitment, and a social allegiance to the UAE. And that's why the vast majority of people stayed in the country.
And that's beautifully said, by the way, because I think the bet was that this is going to collapse.
Absolutely.
And that's the death of the UAE articles, right?
That's where all that
85% expats, everyone's going to pack and go. And I think
that didn't happen.
No, yeah.
And the interesting thing about that is that social allegiance, for you and I, right? well, for me, grown up in Ireland in the 80s and 90s, and Lebanon would be similar. All other countries would be similar. This is a really profound, interesting idea, what is happening here. And this will be looked back at as from a historian's perspective, this chapter, where something new came out of this. Because when we're grown up, you have a political allegiance typically, right? In Ireland, you know, I'm
Oh, that's not even go to political allegiances
well,
in our part of the world.
but it's really around the allegiance piece, right? In Ireland, I wouldn't know who to even really vote for in Ireland because I'm dead inside, right?
Okay.
But most people in Ireland, broadly speaking, again, will vote based on what their grandfather or great-grandfather thought of a civil war that happened in 1922-23, right? In Lebanon, based on the French mandate, the Constitution, 1926, 100 years ago, exactly. The confessional process of your Constitution, everybody, well, not everybody, broadly speaking, because we'll annoy people, they still vote along those ways, and the political allegiance goes that way. What's happened in the UAE is they've created a new system, a new model, and the allegiance is far more practical. It's a practical allegiance. And that practical allegiance, I could see it in that room that day when I was looking around, because everybody in that room has the economic viability to leave, right? They're all financially secure. Second homes, second passports, third homes. They're all, you know, doing very well in life. And yet they're all in that room when there's almost 3,000 missiles and drones fired at them. Why is that? It's because it's economically possible for them to leave, but it's psychologically costly for them to leave. That's a profound shift in the history of this country, I think, because what a lot of us had assumed was that, you know, if you just focus on Dubai, and particularly post-COVID, you had a lot of like really successful people come into the UAE, and it became like almost like Dubai was like the best business class lounge for the global economy in the world. You know, you came here, people enjoyed their wealth, and they flew around the world. Okay, and in that kind of assumption, there's a transactional feel to it. It's a place that you use. But actually, what this has proven is it's a place that you belong.
Yeah.
It's not a place that you use. It's a place that you belong in.
Yeah.
That's more powerful than anything else that comes out of this,
100%.
because it overcomes that, exactly what you said. It overcomes that really old idea that if something happens here, everybody's just going to leave.
Yeah.
And that's proven not to be the case.
I think you've said it, honestly, you've said it beautifully. And I think I will wrap on that note, because I think it's so well said. I don't think we should add more to that. But I wanted to ask you a few rapid fire questions. So UAE GDP growth in 2026, they were thinking 5%. IMF said it's more like 3%. What do you think?
Look, do you know what I think? I think all of the forecasts are ridiculous.
Okay.
Right? Including the IMF's, right? Because one, GDP as an indicator is seriously flawed, right?
Okay.
At the best of times. Particularly when you look at now with AI investment and what's going on, because that would skew things. And how the modern economy has shifted quite a bit. They've made some efforts to counteract that. But so that's just one element as an aside. The second thing is, until we know where the geopolitics lands,
It's just a guess, at this point.
well, it's not even really, like, this is just going to be determined by how long this thing takes for everybody to find the balance of how everybody operates together.
Clear.
Yeah.
The next lever the UAE pulls, maybe if you had to make a guess.
If it was me,
Yeah.
I think one is going to be the sovereign resiliency, and there'll be huge investments made in that space. I think the financialization of assets, you know, you have some sovereign wealth funds here that own a lot of interest in domestic assets, that could be a way for them to pull a lever, and they bring in public markets into them. They have a lot of chips on the table, and this is the thing, right? When these events happen, these kind of gray, or well, this is more of a gray swan, right, than a black swan. We've been saying for years, at some point, there's a risk with the way Iran is in the region. And when these shocks come along, like COVID, the UAE has chips, and is it time to cash this chip? The golden visas. I remember us hosting briefings like 10 years ago with officials here, and they were talking about the idea of expats having more exposure or linkages into the economy. And it was always a case of, it's a conversation, and then at a certain point something happens, and now we cash those chips.
Okay. Best decision a regional CEO can make at the moment?
At the
You
moment,
advise them all the time, so
I would say begin the process of thinking through the lens of sovereign resiliency, because that will bleed down through from a macro to the micro.
So how your company can play a role in that?
How it can play a role, but also how that could impact your industry or sector or your stakeholders or your supply chains and everything that goes around it. Everything is going to be viewed through, how does this ensure that we maximize, control in order to maximize safety and resiliency.
And to the listeners who are listening at the moment, I call them ambitious Arab professionals.
I like it.
So what, maybe one thing that they should be thinking about or doing this year?
I think as this we're working our way through this kind of shock period, I would think of this kind of the 3 Ds, right? Think of D cubed. With this, as it goes on, what you want to do first of all is everybody saying the same thing. How long does this last for? And that determines everything else. But that's not really a useful way of looking at things, because it's just like asking everybody, talking about the weather. Instead, what you're better off doing is assessing the direction of where this situation is going, right? Both from a kinetic point of view and from a diplomatic point of view, and assessing that like over a 24-hour period. And then what you want to do is have a methodical way of looking at the duration of this. And the way you do that is by stop saying, how long is this going to last? And start asking, what needs to change in order for this to stop, this conflict? And then once you have that, you're really able to drive decisions. And those decisions can be, for your career, they can be for your investments, for your family, for your company, whatever it might be. But I feel like everybody has resigned to the fact that we're in this period of uncertainty. And yeah, but there's still a methodical way of going about it. And if you're able to, similar to what I was saying at a kind of macro level, if you're able to take lessons in terms of what are the opportunities that will come out of this, because there will be huge opportunities, and how do I institutionalize them into my life so that I move faster than everybody else? Basically action, right? People could have made a lot of money even just looking at the markets, because it's been so sentiment driven. Action, right? But in a methodical way. So it's assess the direction, the duration, drive decisions, and then you can you take action based on that. Too many people are just sitting back and feeling like it's out of their control, and it's not.
Wonderful. That was a very useful conversation. I want to thank everyone who's listening. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and do let us know what you think. And if you are any other guests you'd like me to host on the podcast, or any topics to tackle, do let me know. Thank you, Trevor.
Lou, lovely to see you, and thank you for the chat.